So I've already introduced myself, but I'll tell you again, Ben Horgan. I'm a patient research partner from Australia. Been part of this group for many years and I'm privileged to be working with some amazing people. And after the last session, I think that we are quite diverse and proud of that. I do feel like a little bit of an imposter though, to be honest, sometimes. I was diagnosed with JIA like over 50 years ago, and the world was a totally different place back then. There were no trials because there were no drugs back then. But I'm proud to say that we've come a long way and people don't end up looking like me anymore, which is kind of cool. Clicker, thank you. So we're going to tell you a little bit about the work that we've done over the last couple of years, really. We kind of went round in circles for a while, trying to work out how to do this, or sort of what it should look like. And then we had, I don't know whether any of you are aware of the Mandalorian show, but we had a "this is the way" moment not so long ago, and did some work which we're going to tell you about. So this is our team. Quite a few of us are here today and taking part in this presentation, which is great. And as I said, quite diverse from many countries and with many backgrounds as well. So what we're going to do, we've split the session up into three topics. We're going to talk a little bit at the beginning, Essie and myself, around the patient perception of overall well-being. Then we're going to have a look at the scoping review and finish off with some physician global assessment chat, which is sort of the work that is yet to come. So you're going to be involved, so get ready to help us with this work. We're looking forward to your feedback and the discussion that we're going to embark on. So these are our objectives. So we're looking for some endorsement around the domain definition of patient perception of overall well-being as it relates to the disease. We want to get to the point where we can start looking at instruments. So you're going to help us with that. And as I said, we're going to sort of preview some of the work that we're looking to do going forward. So I'd like to hand the microphone over to Essie, who's going to continue the discussion with us.
Thank you, Ben. Okay, and thanks everyone for being here. We're excited to present this. So I'm going to give an overview of the domain we've been focusing on, the patient perception of disease / overall well-being domain. And a lot of work led up to this point. So when we last met at OMRAC, the JIA working group that is, it was in 2018. So that was a long time ago. And there was years of work that led up to that workshop that we held, in which we voted on a core domain set for JIA clinical trials. And this was the onion, the OMRAC onion that we resulted, that resulted from that voting. And you're familiar with this. I don't need to go into all the details, except the mandatory domains here are listed. And because JIA is a pretty heterogeneous group, collection of disorders under one umbrella term, we ended up having mandatory in all trials and then mandatory in specific circumstances according to ILAR code. So for the mandatory domains, we decided to start first off with the global domain, and that specifically was the patient perception of disease, overall well-being. Why did we start with that? Well, it seemed actually like it wasn't a very clear domain. We thought this might be a great place to start. We asked lots of globals of our patients in clinic and in clinical trials. We used something called the JDAS, thanks to Dr. Consolaro there, who was one of the developers, and it has globals in it. And so we thought this would be a great place to shine some light and get clarity and agreement. So that's what we've been focusing on for today. So we developed a survey after much debate, as Ben alluded to, and then we administered the survey to various stakeholders. And the goals of the survey, as listed here, We wanted to propose a domain definition for this domain, try to get some agreement around it, a detailed description of the domain and what it entails that would help to guide instrument selection. We wanted to think about how the domain was organized. Specifically, it's called patient perception of disease, overall well-being. Well, what does that mean? Is that a one construct, two, multiple domains within a domain? And then to propose a new title to describe the domain, since the first one was rather confusing. So that was the point of the survey. And we sent the survey to the working group members, and there were about 30 plus, 36 maybe listed, which were across the globe, to an engagement committee, which is largely caregivers, parents of children with JIA, through a learning health network that is based in North America, and then also administered. So those two groups received a red cap survey and then a paper-based survey administered in a clinical setting in Italy. So we're going to kind of march through the survey questions and show the results and then kind of get your feedback and see how you feel about them. So I don't really want to do a lot of reading, but I'll read for those who maybe can't see the slides. The working definition of the domain that we wanted feedback on was patient perception of disease, overall well-being, considers the personal view of the patient or parent on all the ways that JIA affects the patient, including their sense of overall health, their health-related quality of life, and their perception of how well their disease activity is controlled. And the question on the survey was, do you agree with this definition? Next, we proposed a working description of the domain. And this is that the patient perception of disease, overall well-being, captures the personal perception of the patient or caregiver of the aspects of the patient's life impacted by the patient's JIA. It includes the level of disease activity, burden of illness on health, physical, emotional, mental, or social, and impact of treatment, medications, positive effects or negative health symptoms, and administration of medication. Do you agree with the description? And then we got to the third question, which had to do with the organization of the domain. And we knew this might be a tricky question, and we spent a lot of time kind of thinking about how to phrase it. But we present that the patient perception of disease, overall well-being domain consists of an overarching measure of well-being. And then the respondents were given the option that the perception of disease activity should also be measured independently from overall well-being, or that was option one. Option two, that the patient perception of disease activity is part of the domain, but should not be assessed separately. We should just have one overall well-being. And so if they chose to say that we should measure disease activity separately, then we had those people vote on a description of disease activity, which is here. And that is that patient perception of disease activity includes the aspects of the disease that in the personal judgment of the patient or caregiver directly relate to the JIA, such as joint swelling, pain, stiffness, and may possibly respond to treatment. And this should not include symptoms or findings due to another disease or diagnosis, or due to treatment, or due to irreversible damage. So then we asked those people to let us know if they agreed or if they had any feedback. And then finally, we sought to clarify the title of the domain. And so here we asked if people would agree with patient perception of overall well-being as relates to disease as an alternative title to the original. I'm just going to run through those results. We had about 45 respondents, and 24 of those were patients or caregivers. So we were happy with that split across a variety of professions. In fact, some of the patients were actually health professionals and some were researchers as well. and then from 7 different countries and 4 different continents. So primarily about 80% from North America. So here are the questions, because I don't think the definitions, I wasn't expecting everyone to memorize them, but the questions, the definitions, and then the results. And you'll see we use the threshold of 70% for consensus. And so we achieved consensus from patients and caregivers and everyone else on all of the questions that we asked. So people agreed with the definition, they agreed with the description. They chose option 1, which is that we should measure overall well-being, but that we should also measure disease activity. And then those who said yes to option 1 agreed with the description for disease activity. And then everyone thought it could be better named than it was, and they agreed with the title. So I just wanted to share, we got a lot of comments. So people said, yeah, we generally agree with this, but here are our suggestions to make the definitions better, clearer, et cetera. And so we had our working group met a few different times and went through the suggestions and went about revising the definitions and descriptions. And then we had a second survey just to see if people were in agreement with the changes. So I know some people might be happy to hear that we struck out the information on health-related quality of life, which is apparently no longer really well accepted kind of term and very vague. There was a desire for this definition to be unidimensional and not have a bunch of different constructs thrown in there. And so we ended up with a shorter version there. With the new title, Patient Perception of Overall Well-Being as Relates to Disease considers the personal view of the patient on all the ways GIA affects the patient, including their sense of overall health. And then we asked, do they agree? And then quickly for the revised description, just some wordsmithing. Wanted us to give some examples of what negative health symptoms would be, such as side effects, and that it is impacted by the JIA and may be affected by level of disease activity rather than it includes disease activity. And those were the changes. And then we sent it to the people, like 40 of the 45 people gave email addresses and agreed to either be recontacted for survey results or to take the survey again. We sent one email with the survey results and linked to the survey. So we had about a 65% response rate to that. Also split 50-50 with the patient caregivers versus other, sort of same type of representation geographically. And we got agreement from the group on these changes. We got more edits, and I'm just going to share them because they're pretty small, but it was pretty interesting. One parent said that us saying patient perception considers the personal view and their sense of overall health, felt that it was a little bit, what's the word? A little bit kind of patronizing to a patient, and suggested we remove one of those modifiers. So we struck out considers the personal view because their view is their personal view, and remove that. So we're left with patient perception of overall well-being as relates to disease considers the view of the patient on all the ways JIA affects the patient, including their sense of overall health. And then there was a suggestion to change the title again to patient perception of overall well-being related to disease. Just maybe a little cleaner. And then if we're going to say what negative, an example of negative changes, to give some positive changes. And when we talk about health, we remove the word emotional because the WHO definition is physical, mental, social. It doesn't include emotion. So that's kind of the survey we wanted to present. And so now we actually have a lot of time to talk, and then we have a couple poll questions. But we wanted to get some feedback on the process, the results.
Did you have a chance to get the patient to explain to you their thinking when they look at the phrasing, each part of it, to understand when they read the sentence, what are they thinking?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have planned as next steps. You know, we kind of got this through the working group and make sure it was clear, was to meet with people in clinic and read it with them and get their understanding prior to selecting an instrument. And I don't know, Alessandro, you did this?
I've been doing that with very few patients in the last weeks. And I think that it was extremely clear to patient what was the differences between the two levels of the domains. So the general one and the subdomain of activity. I had only, so the few patients that I've interviewed that they were interested in why we were doing that. So the most of the discussion was about why, but not about the problem itself. It was really very, very clear that the two levels and this where the discussion was. So about your question, I would say that yes, it was clear. What is the difference when the broader concept of the burden of the disease and the concept of disease activity?
Okay. So the second question is, normally we would not decide on whether a domain is unidimensional or not, because in fact, you talk about the instrument being unidimensional because it's related to the performance of the item. So you can't decide at the beginning of the domain whether it is unidimensional. You have to do a factor analysis to show that they are unidimensional.
I think maybe we wanted to be really clear in the definition, have a very sort of concise and clear definition with a little bit more explanation. If you notice, the description has lots of stuff in it, but when someone is approaching the definition, we were seeking clarity, and I guess it was a little confusing to people as well. And particularly that one term, health-related quality of life, seemed to introduce a lot of other factors, financial, you know, things that we maybe are not as interested in when we're considering did the medication work.
Why I am waiting for more inputs, is it fair to say that we also discussed whether disease activity was a more technical term? So even if we think or imply it's the same thing, in order to respond to Ernest's point, that we discussed whether it's more like a technical term from the healthcare professionals that we then equate as being the same as. So you're right, we didn't do any statistics to cover it. It was based on logic or.
Just to add to that, Tim can speak to it because he's working on it. He developed a prompt to assess disease activity for patients. That was his intention. But before he actually started the work, he went to the patient to ask them about the concept of having a questionnaire to assess the disease activity. And the answer from the patient was very clear. They can give him a symptom activity, but they can't give them a disease activity because the disease activity is what the doctor do. The patient can give them the symptom, but the disease is a medical professional term.
No, I think that's really interesting, and it's how you separate those two out. Could I just ask as well, the patients that responded, what was the age range of those?
Yeah, I have to look that up. The patients, I think they were more in their 20s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I'm just wondering if that has something as well to do with the narrative of how they wanted to sort of rephrase some of that.
That was a parent.
Okay. Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
A parent who's also a researcher.
Mhm.
Like they identified, I'm not supposed to know who they are.
Yeah.
But they had checked a bunch of different
Okay.
professions. We gave them options to say what they did. So
Mhm.
they might have had that other level of insight.
Right. Okay.
And interestingly, some of the parents were also patients themselves.
Right, okay.
So they had like multiple
Yeah, yeah.
views on this.
Mm,
Pretty interesting.
thank you.
We had several conversations around how to keep the clarity of the question and to ensure we were asking what we were meaning to ask, but keep it as simple as possible. So obviously we're dealing with children, but we could potentially be dealing with, people with very low health literacy. And I guess this definition that we've come up with, you could almost call it a starting point, because there could be many ways that we could ask that question, but we needed to make sure that we got the question right, so that if we did design something that maybe looked more like an infographic or was colorful in some ways, at least we had the starting point that we could all work from, basically. So yeah, it took a bit of work, but
I want to ask maybe a naive question, because I'm pretty naive to the methodology. But so you mentioned there are two levels to the domains. So ultimately, these are domains we're going to recommend for use in clinical trials. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And so are you then saying that there will be a separate domain for kind of overall well-being versus kind of a subdomain for well-being related to disease? Or are we just landing on narrowing this down to well-being related to disease?
so this conversation started with a survey that was done in Canada. Was that right? The survey. Anyway, so the work came out with focus groups that were asked about this question, and it was whether the global question should include the patient's views on how the disease was going, as well as the other sort of holistic issues. And the focus groups came back really clearly that they were different issues altogether, and they should be asked separately, not all together in one global. So that's where the sort of the thinking started. It actually came from focus groups of children and adults as well, or parents of children. So this was a new idea to us, and this is why we went down this pathway. We actually had several Zoom meetings between ourselves, and we didn't argue with each other, but we couldn't come to consensus within our own group, and we just kept saying the same things again and again. And that's when what I mentioned before, around we had the "this is the way" moment. Let's do a survey and ask people whether what we're thinking is actually what they want. And the consensus was pretty clear in the end that we do need to ask these questions separately, because the patients feel like the disease part of that question is so important, it needs to be asked on its own, and it can't be muddled in with all sorts of other issues.
I just wanted to add that probably all this started with the title of the domain that we had in our core set, because when we had to start thinking of how to measure this domain, looking at how it was written there, we felt it was not possible. We were going on discussing, because patient perception of disease bracket well-being was too difficult. So that was the starting of all this discussion, and why we ended up that we needed to be more clear. Otherwise, it was too difficult to work on the measure.
So I have a couple of then practical thoughts, kind of how this would be implemented in a clinical trial. So I definitely get the perception of well-being as it relates to disease, because I can see how that can change when we intervene, and so then we can measure an outcome. Overall well-being, I'm struggling with, because I'm thinking there's so many factors that go into that. And I'm also thinking, somebody mentioned this would be very age dependent. So our clinical trials start at age 2 and go through 17 plus. So of course, on one end of the spectrum, you might have breastfeeding problems. On the other end, you might have peer relationship issues. So extremely different concepts that are not disease related. So just a few thoughts in terms of practical implementation, what it would look like in terms of being able to measure a drug being effective versus not.
Yeah, well, the next step is going to be instrument selection. We needed to start with the definitions. And I put the onion back up because, yes, we've done focus groups. Actually, Beth Gottlieb led some focus groups in New York. That's why we were in Canada. We did tons of focus groups prior to this onion. Okay, we had online discussion boards, all this stuff. I heard about the CNO group with the hundreds of domains. We didn't have hundreds, but we did, we tried to thread this needle when we came up with the title of that domain, and it came back to kind of bite us because it's just, we couldn't define it in coming up with the domain. Like it took so much work, literally a year of conversations and people arguing about what do you mean, and all to get to where we are now. So it looks kind of simple, but it was actually a lot of work. Where I'm going with this is that we have these other things about fatigue and emotional function, mood, physical activity, separate is physical function. So there's pain, that are not under this umbrella. However, when we ask the patients about their overall well-being, they do factor a lot of those things into it. But then, Beth, do you want to, I have a specific, like when you talked about how the kids answered disease activity versus overall well-being versus the parents? Yeah.
So I had done this through PR Coin, which is our learning health network, and had two separate focus groups. One was a group of parents and one was a group of teenagers. I think they were 12 and up, and asked them just to speak about what they considered when they completed the measure. And since they were all part of PR Coin, they all did this measure every time they filled out the other questionnaires and so on. And so it was a pretty fair geographic distribution. There was multiple different centers, different subtypes of arthritis represented. So it was really taking into account many different factors and backgrounds of where these people were coming from, and different medications. Some were only on something oral, some IV, sub-Q, et cetera. The parents talked a lot about worrying about side effects. They worry what will happen to their child later, all of the unknown. They also talked about missing days of work for multiple appointments, their child missing out on activities. That was the vast majority of what they talked about. And then they talked a little bit, of course, about pain, fatigue a little bit, things of that sort. But the majority were things that are not directly related to disease activity. The teenagers thought nothing about side effects, maybe not surprising, right? Their immediate view. They did think about missing some activities. They talked about morning stiffness and pain. So there was a lot of discrepancy between the parents and the kids, who maybe the kids focused a little bit more about the disease and the parents didn't think about actual disease parameters as much.
Do we have time for an extra comment?
So actually, it's not too difficult to operationalize it. So you could put an NRS scale of a question about asking them what is the global assessment of disease activity, and a separate question, what is the global assessment of their well-being, global health well-being. And actually, when you do it in rheumatoid, the two don't correlate. So they score it differently. So that tells you that they're measuring two different things.
Right, that's what we're trying to get at. Right. And we didn't include the data, but Dr. Consolaro, Printo has this like 9,000 patient EPICA study where they looked exactly at that. We probably should have included that data and looked at what are they measuring, but that data kind of informed this. There should be two different, we had some of these debates we have patient research partners who were saying, no, we don't want disease activity separate. Kind of went like that. And then the doctors were like, we need two separate because we do treat to target and we don't want to be adjusting medicines based on somebody's worried about, missing whatever, or something that didn't have to do with the medicine, right? So there were all these debates. So the numbers came out funny in that the doctors and others were less likely to endorse having two separate than the patients were. So I don't know if it's just unique to our group or, but it kind of went through. And sorry, Marika.
I always struggle with disease activity and overall well-being because there is sort of like a confounding, right? Because if your overall well-being is really bad, you probably as a patient report more disease activity because you have like pain and fatigue due to other like reasons than just your disease activity. And that's a little bit where I struggle with measuring and disease activity and overall well-being, because I think there is like a sort of like a confounding going on between those two. And maybe you should do both because maybe you will find that confounding. But yeah, there is something that ties them together, of course.
The correlation on these 9,000 patients in the EPOCA study was pretty high, was 0.7 between the two scales. One was about the well-being, and one is specific for the disease activity. We have this multidimensional questionnaire that's 16 questions, and the two scales that are not in the same page. No, by the patient. But it was very interesting to go into this correlation and see, for example, that patients with a very short disease duration have a higher correlation than patients with a longer disease duration. And also that the correlation was geographically different. So there is a lot of things to look inside this different. No, I'm saying that geographic areas, continents, let's say.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alexandra.
But it was not difference according to the education level when we are talking about the parents, and it was not different or not very different for the economic, the economic level of the families. It was interesting, maybe.
Yeah, so the data you're giving now does look like there's a substantial correlation. And so if at any point in time, this level of correlation is being reported, any difference that occur obviously might be potentially a confounder that is coming to be able to change that difference. And so at what point in time do you think it will be sufficient to drop one item and choose only one? Or would you want to continue having these both items and be having this co-correlation going on? And how do you think you want to approach this?
Very good question, and also I don't have an answer. We are starting working with that and see that there are no other this data that I'm talking are probably unique for pediatric rheumatology about this differential assessing of these two domains and subdomain. So I do not have an answer for that. I think we need so much these two information for clinical trials because they are different. We need to know if at the end of the trial the patients are well in general, and if the drugs work for what the drug is expected to work. So on symptom of the disease. I think these two information, that is my personal thinking, are very important, and I would go on collecting both of them.
Yeah, so this might just be a suggestion. I never wanted to make a suggestion, but otherwise, given I don't know how much of the sample was from the data you reporting right now, but if you're having correlation up to 7, then it does mean that there will be challenge in differentiating how each of these domains will work independently. So it's going to be of concern even when you move forward to start measuring it. And so we can talk more about the methodology and some of the challenges we'll have when items are very closely correlated in this form. And you know, and that perhaps is not the focus of today. But if you're beginning to see this kind of data, we might want to rethink and consider how we can justify one item sufficiently enough to capture both entities.
Well, I'll pick up the last question. Oh, sorry, we have an extra now. I think, Sandra, part of the answer is we have received endorsement for that number of domains. So that I think that's part of the answer. So we need to cover it with one thing, independent of the measurement.
Very quick, if you worry about redundancy and overlapping and overburdening the patient, what you can do is you take it both questions in the clinical trial and you just take away one of the questions to see whether your sensitivity change. And if your sensitivity doesn't change, you know, you can drop it. And it's pretty easy to deal with.
Yeah, there are 2 clinical trials that are going on with these 2 information collected. But
And really, that was my quick comment, because if it's measuring the same thing or measuring something closely correlated, then don't overburden patient, PI at the site with an extra potential multi-question instrument.
thank you.
Or on the phone, I mean, on the Zoom. Is there any? Okay, thank you.
I suppose I'll share. For me, one of the reasons that I think it's important to capture both is because there is a higher rate of comorbidities with JIA than there are with some other conditions. So like as somebody that has EDS and JIA, I can tell you very specifically what pain of mine is EDS and what pain of mine is my systemic JIA. I can tell you very specifically which one is active versus which one isn't active. And so for me, I want to be able to say, I know this specific number is correlating to my disease activity for my systemic JIA, but I also need you to know that like my EDS is, you know, flaring lately. And so like that's contributing to my overall, you know, well-being and things like that. I think that's something that we have to keep in mind because like we know these conditions travel in packs like velociraptors, right? There's never just one. There's always a group of them. And I think that the more that we encompass collecting data about both, the more that we're not limiting the types of patients that we're able to involve in clinical trials and things like that, because we're not omitting folks who have multiple comorbidities.
Thank you. Any other comments before we move on?
So I just wanted to add that, you know, sometimes when you have items correlating like this, they become very redundant. And so as we proceed, we need to rash model each of these domains and see how they fit into each other. And why, as an entity, it might be nice from a methodological point of view, it's just redundant. If they significantly correlate, it does not necessarily add value to make this measurement in duplicates. And so that's something that we need to consider.
There may be, you know, as a clinician, probably first, I think where I'm coming from, and I know we keep talking about clinical trials. When in 2018, we were talking about clinical trials and longitudinal observational studies, kind of some of what, you know, Viveka was talking about today with the dating, you know, like she wanted to be able to see these in practice. It helps us to see that difference because in some patients, they're very divergent, as Grayson was saying, and it may be the mental, emotional, social, other things in addition. And it's extremely informative in clinical practice. Perhaps in a clinical trial, you're right. You might not want to ask both, but I think it does really influence some of our decision making. And we didn't put that in the survey. Initially we did, and everyone said, take it out. You're doing leading questions. So we had to take that information out. But I think maybe that might be some of the healthcare provider interest in the information. But that might be separate from the clinical trial consideration, as you're saying. And I think it's worth getting that data or using the data from Printo and reconsidering. Yeah, thank you for that. We do have to move on because we've got other side. Oh, Corinne?
I just wanted to say that I agree with Grayson's comments on, you could have trials where kids only have JIA, but then the thing is comorbidities and trying to make sure that you get real life population, real life patients, right? Not just people who will fit the criteria of a trial that then will never be applied to any of the kids that have all these other comorbidities. And the other thing is also the importance of contextual factors. I know Robin is going to be on my side. So all the contextual factors that you need to assess in a trial are going to be very important. So I think if you assess well-being, if it's seen as being important from patients' perspective, then it's not the same. Like, if it's a different construct, maybe it should be assessed, but maybe there's an importance, it's important to look at all contextual factors that will have an impact on these outcomes. So I think that's a big thing, because then you can have these outcomes and they mean nothing if you don't assess all contextual factors.
Right. Good point. Thank you. So we do have polls, and if you go to your app, it basically is asking you if you're comfortable to endorse our Delphi findings, and then whether you agree that we need separate measurement tools for overall well-being and disease activity, which is what the respondents felt. And then you can work on that, and we'll move on to our next speaker.
Awesome. So we would love to have more discussion than anything else on this, because it is definitely in its infancy. So please feel free to jump in, but I'm going to talk a little bit about our scoping review and where it's at, and then get some feedback from you guys. So the objectives are to review our search terms and methodology, talk about a couple sample instruments to kind of think about how we could move this process along with some things we're already using in clinical practice that may have a preliminary domain match, and then look for your feedback on the planning of our process and the psychometric complexities. So our scoping review, we are at this point going to use 3 databases. I'm working with a librarian at the University of Washington to look at PubMed, SynHall, and Embase. So the results today are just the first preliminary PubMed search. And basically we're going to break it down, and you'll see the search terms in a minute, but they're really ugly, obviously. So I wanted to break down how we built them, or how Teresa, my librarian, built them, because librarians are genius. So the first section is about kind of just the identifiers. We wanted to make sure we were pulling arthritis, juvenile arthritis, and also just JIA. We know there are useful tools in the adult literature, so we didn't want to just do juvenile arthritis. The second section is to identify instruments. Questionnaire is kind of essentially what we're looking for to be able to pull those instruments. The third section is where I'm going to need your help. So we identified already notable instruments that we know are out there, but we want to make sure we get all of them. So that's one of the poll questions for you guys today, for things that you already know about, and there'll be many in there, but redundancy is good. And then the last section is essentially just to pull validity and results and reliability studies to make sure that we can, if possible, create a good set that is already validated if they're out there. So these are our search terms at the moment. Obviously, I do not expect you to read them in general, but so this is essentially like our first arthritis section. This is the second section. This is the big long one. So this is where your help will be very useful to see if there are things that you already are aware of or you're using in your clinical practice. And I'm happy to talk through these with anyone. I can't promise that I know exactly how they're functioning, but my librarian does, which is really helpful. So to kind of talk about what we have found. So this is the updated search as of this morning. So we have just in PubMed 2,000 results, and I'll talk about kind of how we got here a little bit. But hopefully we have hit, and with your help, we will have even better, but kind of a Goldilocks in the middle situation. So on the left was adding, without having an arthritis and for the tool section, looking at the results preliminarily, we had lots of other diseases that were using similar tools. So we kind of swung the other way, and we added a juvenile arthritis to the tools section, which obviously with only 474 results was too narrow. So we are hopeful that this middle section, which delineates an arthritis and within that the tool section, will give us kind of somewhere around what we want, with that ideally about 30% of the studies being hopefully useful. So kind of to work through a couple potential domains that are tools that might work with our domain. As a reminder, this is from the OMRECT workbook, sorry, and the instrument selection algorithm that we will use throughout the process. So to come up with just a couple and talk about our two different domains and subdomains, this is one instrument that looks at overall well-being. So many of us use this in clinical practice, the CJDES that Alessandra and his group helped develop. And so the question is quite simple. It's considering all of the ways that you or your child's JIA affects your child and kind of rate how they're doing. 0 being very well, 100 being very poorly, asking them to put it essentially on a VAS scale. So this is kind of hopeful. Essentially, what I think will be helpful to hear from you guys today is, and we'll see this in the next question as well, is this is pulling one question from a multi-question survey that is validated within the multi-question survey. And we want to get your feedback on what your thoughts are on doing that. Very similarly, the disease activity, there's a lot less specific, already validated instruments that we know about kind of off the top of our heads. So this was one from the JAMAR. And reading this, it's considering all of the symptoms such as pain, joint swelling, morning stiffness, fever, if due to arthritis, rash, if due to arthritis. Please evaluate your level of activity of your illness at the moment. Again, 0 being no activity, 10 being maximum activity. So this is more of a more specific one to the disease activity, and again, is pulled from the JAMAR. So it's one of the questions. So those are, I'm happy to go back or forward if people have questions, but I will hand it off to Robin to do some discussion questions, and we want you guys' feedback.
Yeah, in order to kind of like cope with what we've just seen, we are at this stage, which is the famous next step in OMRECT. Now we have covered the domains. Now we're moving into measurements. Of course, we'll need to scrutinize what's already being used out there, as we just saw. So now we are asking you to help us with a couple of things. Please, bullet number 1 would be, please write into the app any instruments that you are aware of that should be part of the scoping review, i.e. please flag if you know something that we don't or that we've missed, or maybe it's already in our notes because you only saw the quick version. So if there are some measurements that you think are candidates, then we can use it part 1 directly in our further scrutiny, or part 2 as search terms to reduce the number of counts, actually to increase the number of counts. When we add the or, then it's already exploding. So is that, maybe we should take a couple of questions on that part while some are typing. Please, Essie. Oh, very important.
Yeah, thank you, Erin, for that presentation. I was just perhaps the group, why the choice of scoping review and not systematic review?
To be honest, the size of our group and the efficiency, we have 1 fellow right now. I'm going to try and make extra in this, but I think extra help, and it sounds like Laura has thoughts too.
While I go to Lara, I can say it's much about terminology. Standard systematic review techniques are not applicable to the same extent as we usually have, say, whether treatment I is better than treatment C on a specific outcome. So we have scoping literally means more open. So actually, I think, Lara, is it fair to say when we say scoping, we still mean systematic, but it's a little bit like, yeah, a new terminology.
Yes, scoping refers to the systematic searching, but it doesn't have the critical appraisal approach, which you don't need at this point if you're just looking for instruments. When you get into the next step, when you find a candidate instrument, you want to evaluate the measurement properties, then you would do a systematic review of the measurement properties because you want to critically appraise the studies that have been done to make sure that they're of high quality evidence when you're looking at the results of those. So it's 2 separate ideas. At this stage, when you want to find things, as Robin said, it's a broad approach, but the search, as has been nicely outlined, is systematic so that people, and publishable so that people can reproduce that.
Just as a follow-up, do you have a protocol published for this work? You're just going to have a protocol not published, and you're going to go through and publish the final work?
I think it's fair to say that the protocol is still being elaborated on. We just wanted to, actually, we need your input. That's the right way to answer that. So before we can close it, because we will need to register it. Maybe on Prospero, if we are allowed, not necessarily Prospero take scoping reviews at this stage. No.
I think Laura is right. So because you are not trying to make a conclusion, no, because usually you can't do it. You do the scoping review, and you do have to do a secondary search when you start to assess the psychometric assessment of the instrument in the second. Like this is what Cosman would do, right? So you do the Cosman checklist, you do the scoping of the instrument, and then you do a full Cosman checklist of the psychometric property.
Yeah, I would just say I would agree. It's the same thing with the shared decision-making working group. We wanted to do a systematic review, but then it would be like extremely complex with tons of instruments that are not necessarily matching your domain or feasible. So then what's the point of looking at all their measurement instrument and doing all this work on all these instruments that are maybe not? Yeah, so Lara convinced us of that. and we agreed. We were happy in the end.
So while we are thinking about that searching phenomenon, I think we can introduce the second bullet. Do you think then, let's assume that, let's go one step back. One of the reasons why we at OMRAC and other organizations expect people to be systematic or use whatever review technique is actually that we want to make sure that we are not completely ignorantly forgetting something that is also being used out there. As you know, that's called evidence-based research. We need to show that we at least pretend that we know all the literature out there. So that's why this is a critical step. But because the next step could be then when we find all these measures that you probably know most of them, as we would hope, then do you think it's fair that we could start kind of like cherry picking? Do you think that we can consider use of single items if we find composite outcome measures out there? Is that a valuable path to pursue? So kind of like, in my world, we usually come back to test 28 when we need examples. We have all these single items or single stories that we combine. Do you think it would be fair to look at single questions?
I think you can, but there's always a problem if some of them are linked, right? Because even in these composites measures, sometimes they have like question 1 and 2 are linked together and will give you like, the quality of life or something like that. And I think you have to at least pay attention to that and really make sure that you understand the composite score, because it might be that if you just take one of the two, it might not be very valid anymore. And I think that's where your potential problem will be. And you'll have to do another validity study because you can't do it without using the whole composite to say it's a valid tool. So that's the only downside of doing that. If you cherry pick, then you'll have to, like, whatever you cherry pick, test again to see if it's still valid in the population that you want to test it in. Yeah.
I have a comment. It seems kind of from what we talked about, I heard that obviously it's important to separate domains for patients because they could mean completely different things. We heard that Dr. Cancelaro's group identified that there begins to be a dissociation into concepts as somebody has disease longer and longer. We also heard that parents interpret well-being completely different than teenagers. So I think this needs to really be kind of tailored to the purpose of the research, because I can't imagine that a single question would be able to get at the types of complex concepts that Grayson was describing, for example. And at the same time, in a clinical trial, I can't imagine filling out, 3 additional batteries of questions to get at something that should be kind of quick, universal, simple, and correlate with potentially drug activity on disease. So I'm not sure if OMRAC does that, but maybe for different purposes, there should be different recommendations for how extensive the survey.
You may have just described the last year of our lives.
So I don't know that you need to agonize over whether we think, because this is, to me, not relevant. You do the work and the work will tell you, the result of the analysis will tell you whether you can or you can't. So I don't know that you need to struggle with whether you think at the beginning one item will work. So I think you look at the performance of the instruments, and if it doesn't work, a single item, you have to reject it. If it works reasonably well, you may accept that as a compromise. It may not. So, I mean, at the first step is when you do the Cosman review, you're going to look at whether a particular existing instrument has the right psychometric property. And if they don't have the right psychometric property, you're going to have to drop them anyway. And unless you decided to look at individual item within that, and that would be a lot more technical, that would involve a lot more analysis for you to do.
Yes, and that's where I'm wondering, like if they're just taking out one question, global question from an entire previously validated full instrument.
So this is exactly what Tim did. He did a systematic review, took all the instrument, put all the items to a patient group, and individually assess each of the item to pull out the best performing item. Now, that's a lot of work.
Yeah, but I wonder if sometimes if you want a really good domain match, right? If you really want to assess the definition you have, then you need to find maybe items here and there that are the best, and then you put it together. It's funny because in the FLAIR group, and I don't know if other people's are in the FLAIR group, but in the FLAIR group, they had some instruments, but the match wasn't great. And so in the end, they developed an instrument of FLAIR with all the good elements, and then they validated it. And now the domain match, I guess, is perfect, right? Because, yeah, so anyway, I think we might find that all instruments are not really assessing perfectly what we want.
Well, that's very helpful. In the interest of time, because I want to get to Beth and Cassandra's work, we will pass it off.
So I'm happy to present you the very preliminary part of our work on another domain, which is the physician perception of the disease activity. So this is the group of people that is now working on this issue. It's a very multinational and representative of all the entities that are involved in JIA research. So this is the instrument that we are using in every clinical trial for JIA. And I do not have to tell you why it is important. We have a ACR pediatric core set, which is the same as the DOT core set, in which we have this tool. We have the disease activity score, in which there is this tool, the definition of inactive disease, and of course, the treat to target. This is very important. But there is literature. This is just one example showing how heterogeneous is the way pediatric rheumatologists use this tool. So we decided to do a survey asking to pediatric rheumatology community to give a value from 0 to 100 to a long list of items that can be included and can be part of the physician global assessment. We used the two large organizations, both in North America and in the rest of the world, involving pediatric rheumatologists. One is Printo and one is PureCoin. And we ended up with more than 500 responses to our little questionnaire. We have a representative from all geographic areas, all levels of involvement in pediatric rheumatology. We have also some adult rheumatologists participating and residents as well. These are the items that we ask to rank from 0 to 100, and the graph shows the interquartile range of the scoring given to each item. You see that this is We did it separately for systemic JIA and non-systemic JIA. You know, we have a very heterogeneous disease, but we just did it into these two groups, and you see that the more reduced spread is for the rating of swollen joint count and tender joint count. But you can see there is a very large spread of the values for functional ability, for imaging, for the type of joints involved, and also very interesting about the extra-articular manifestation. And for our disease, this means in particular uveitis and psoriasis for psoriatic arthritis. And this questionnaire had also a part with 17 clinical scenarios, very well described, in which we asked the responder to give to score the physician global assessment in these cases. And you see that the interquartile range again was very large for many cases, and especially this one, the first one, in which a patient was in remission with active uveitis. Also quite interesting, we did some sub-analysis, and we showed we have seen that physicians in different geographic areas tend to score significantly differently the physician global assessment, and this is the sum of the physician global assessment scores in the 17 cases. So physician from Northern Europe is here tend to score to give a lower score. Now we are about sending out the second survey here. First, we tried to give a draft of the definition of the domain, and this is the last draft that we have. I read it with you. So disease activity reflects the aspect of the disease related to the pathophysiological process that might be reversible with treatment and can worsen with the disease flare. Disease activity can be determined immediately after a complete clinical examination of the child. Disease activity is different from disease damage, with the latter reflecting irreversible changes of the body's tissues from an inflammatory disease, and findings known or suspected to be due to another disease process, such as comorbidities or side effects of JAA treatment, should not be considered in this evaluation. So here is again a list of items that can be included, and we ask the respondent to rate them, to rank them. We ask to rank the 7 most relevant, and we have a few questions that specifically go into those more debated issues. So the inclusion of comorbid condition or such as uveitis or psoriasis, and also about the of considering imaging when scoring the physician global assessment. So again, this is the panel, and I'm really happy to have your opinion of this preliminary work that is before our working group work on this domain. Thank you.
So I guess I just want to add a question, ask a question. So, can you remind me, like, in the CARA groups, like the physician, how do you call it, the physician global, was that something that was perceived to be very important by patients? And that was a question I had. And the other question is, the definition you showed, it said disease activity, but you mean physician global assessment of disease activity in the definition you meant, right? So to me, I'm just wondering the difference between objective disease activity, which is often like, I don't know, active joint count or whatever number of, versus, and also maybe other things that we should take into account. And it's kind of an objective, more objective, versus, you know, what does it add to have the physician's opinion about it? And the question is, the physician, is the physician taking into account more elements? So I would like to see like all these elements that they take into account. So one of my question is, what if they have someone in front of them that is more like just complaining a lot about everything. So are they gonna actually say, well, I think disease activity is lower for that person because they always complain. So this time is not worse than another. So what's the place with bias in this? Sorry.
Okay, I just want to say the OMER Act, you said something about CARA, but we did the core domain. In the onion, this is an optional, which is why we included it because we had time. And we thought we might as well see how people feel about the definition so that we can then go about finding, since we're all here and we won't see everyone for 2 years. But leading up to 2018, we found there was a tremendous discordance between what physicians valued and what patients valued. Patients did not value this. Physicians all was like 99%. Yeah, and in the same way with the patient global, the physicians didn't value it as much, but overall it still hit 70 in both groups. And that's why it became mandatory.
It is the aim of what we are doing. It is not just joint count, because I think one of the reasons why our disease activity score works, which has both other than the patient global assessment, there's the physician and the count of joint with active disease, and it works because the physician global assessment probably gives away those joints that are involved. We don't use a selected joint count, so each joint counts one. But of course, the impact of the inflammation level, other than the number of joints that are included, matters in terms of measuring the disease, I think. And that's the answer, but we will see what else is included in this perception. Also, then I removed a slide in which we ask in the same survey if a patient with oligoarticular disease and two patients, one with the oligoarticular disease and one with the polyarticular disease as a classification at a certain time point had the same clinical presentation, same number of active joints. Would your physician global assessment be the same? And we had exactly 50% responders saying one thing and the other saying the other.
So help me understand the second question that you're asking. So you said that could a physician global include laboratory tests and imaging, and is it feasible, right? That was the question that you posted on there. So are you asking that because you feel that a composite outcome is better, but you are worried? So if I'm going to use a physician global in a clinical practice, okay, then I will only able to do if they have to be in that set, then I will have to have lab tests and I have to have imaging result in order to score the global.
Exactly.
So that is quite a logistic challenge in routine clinical practice.
Yes, exactly.
Is a very big, so you could have that as a composite outcome measure. I can score the physician global, I can wait for the lab test result, and then I can enter those to get a composite score. But if you ask me that I can only score the global if I have the lab result and the image,
this is a point.
Isn't that bullet number 3, if you can phrase that as a question, because then the word comes in disease activity. So we move from global, from bullet 2 to bullet 3. We actually introduce a little bit like that when
not going to help.
Immediately word raised a lot of discussion.
This is not going to help at all what I'm going to say, but I mean, some patients come to the appointment with labs and imaging beforehand already, and I can't be blind to that when I think about my physician global assessment. So
I don't have an answer.
But also when you do, sorry, when you do the ultrasound, when you're visiting a patient and you have the ultrasound machine right to your hand and you use it to check
Yeah.
the ankle, how it is, how can you?
So if you keep it separate, it doesn't stop you doing that. It doesn't stop. You can definitely use the ultrasound. They can definitely. So it doesn't stop you have to do that. So you can definitely. Yeah. Well, you definitely, because in your case, your physician global allows you to do that. But if you force it into the criteria, then I have to have it.
We do not have to force that.
Yeah.
But
Well, and to add to that, I think of Physician Global actually as something that measures intangibles. So kind of the overall, for example, in a clinical trial of PCGIA, we may not have uveitis as part of disease activity. We have, because our primary endpoint is ACR pediatric 30, right? So it doesn't specifically say anything about uveitis in there. But if there's uveitis, sure, it will be reported as an adverse event, but it's a huge marker of disease activity. And that's the only place where that will show up in the ACR pediatric 30. So that's kind of how I think about it. It's these things that cannot be measured easily with other CRP and MRI and ultrasound that you can add to a clinical trial if you want to, but
But I think the thing is you need to also define it. Like to me, I would like to see what is included. So if someone includes like ultrasound or if someone includes different things, I mean, it needs to be comparable, I think. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's like, your pain, precision of pain is kind of, it's difficult to
this is
define.
objective number one. So if at the end of this effort, so we'll have this second survey, and then the plan is to have a consensus meeting among this group and provide some guidelines. So
Yeah.
if at the end of this effort, we will reduce the variability, I
Yeah.
think it's already a success.
Yeah.
Then I agree with both comments, even though they tend to be conflicting, but I think that they are both right.
Yeah.
So if you look at other conditions, right, physician global, if you look at the contribution of the different disease activity, what physician use to assess a patient global, you can rank them. You can see them straight away, and you can see the physician definitely use different component to a patient, right? Patient is going
From
to
some
use
kind of
pain
regression
as a
model,
much
yeah.
higher anchor. Physician is going to use the swollen joint count followed by the lab test result. It is there already. It's inherently in there already.
Now we're off with microphones. So do we want
No, I was gonna say, I mean, that's what we found with our first OMERACT voting, right? The physicians ranked one thing and then the patients ranked something else.
Yeah, so Alexander, it's possible for you to have those multiple items. Just like Ed said, is going to be a composite score. But I mean, there's an opportunity for us to learn from the complexities of composite score. There's going to be a talk during the meeting. You have to also consider the fact that each of those domains that you're bringing in come in with perhaps the interest is it increases the validity, but then it comes with its own reliability challenges too. And so how you manage how that noise affects the total outcome, the total number that is going to be used to make your judgment is something to bear in mind. And so when you decide to have all of those items in, as much as it is very enticing for you to be able to increase how much of sensitivity you have for that particular measurement, it comes with these drawbacks too. And the amount of items you're going to be measuring creates a feasibility challenge that you want to consider, but then it's a trade-off. If it serves your purpose, it's okay, but then you just need to balance what you want to get out of it, and also consider the independent challenges and noise, errors that will come from each of these items you're bringing together.
Yes, of course, it is important. I think, so here we are trying to understand what the pediatric rheumatology think and use these as an information for developing guideline for a more homogeneous scoring of the way of the physician global assessment. And about the so introducing more complexity with a composite tool for measuring physician global assessment, that there was somebody in the task force suggesting to add another BAS about extra-articular manifestation and considering separately ultrasound or MRI assessment. I think this could probably add too much complexity, but this should be, at least in the second case, data-driven.
Actually, just as a comment to you, remember that's why it's for research purposes. We are always allowed to include all extra measures. So that's the reason why we can do more research and should do more research, including probably some regression models to talk about how much can be explained by various things. So we have, oh, yeah, actually.
So I wondered, so in trials right now, when disease activity or when physician perception of disease activity is assessed, is it assessed well by clinicians in the trials? So I'm wondering, just because like some patients say sometimes like, oh, the physician didn't do like a great joints assessment, it wasn't great, but then they look at the lab test a lot, or they look at the, like, so is it now that it's kind of very subjective? Every clinician who's going to be involved in a trial is assessing, it's assessed in different ways between clinicians, even at one hospital involved in one trial of a drug. I wonder about that. Like, is it now, like, or are they, did any study ask them like, hey, what did you base this on? Did you base this on? And that's what you're going to check. But I guess that's why it's so important to define what you mean by it so that you can measure it. So I don't know if it's well measured now or not.
It is that one that we have shown here. All these physicians that were interviewed were possible participants to clinical trial, and they were, because they are in Printo, and so these are the physicians that scored a physician global assessment in clinical trial, and some of them include uveitis.
They're usually more standardized in trials.
There is just the leading sentence to the. So this is the tool that is in the clinical trials. It says, considering the worst signs and symptoms of disease at the moment of the present visit, please rate the overall level of disease activity of the by marking circle. Yes. I don't know. Is it different in adult rheumatology trial? Yes. Yes. We want to improve this because we.
I also think that from the perspective of a trainee, we get almost no training on this or how to do it. You walk in the clinic and someone's like, that feels like a 3 today. So I think standardizing it for the future of practice could be helpful for trials, can be helpful for trainees, can be helpful for our patients. It's going to be a while, but I think that at least we're starting.
At least for Printo trials and PSST as well, there is a training on the joint examination, but not on this.
There is not, yeah, which would be immensely helpful for trainees. Yeah,
That
we should
study
probably
with all the lines, we did that actually for PR Coin because we wanted to train the fellows and everybody initially. And so we came up with case studies and we're like, oh, this would be not hard to use as training cases. And everyone was all over the map. So then we did try to make a training, and I'm so glad that you all picked it up and are doing this now because this can lead to training, but we still need to vote. So can you
Please open your
advance
apps.
the slide?
Give us your thoughts.
before academic. So as Alessandra mentioned, this is going to be distributed to that big group of people again. This is refined from that first exercise to see if there's agreement, but we were curious to know what people felt in the room. So thank you for that. So thanks everyone for your attention and all the really fantastic input. I think we got like a treasure trove of things to think about and advice and you know, strategy and methods. It was really valuable. So thank you for bringing your whole self. And thanks to everyone who participated, the working group and all those who did the surveys and our methodologists, Laura and Robin and Ernest did some emails and all the patience and support of the group. So thank you.